What if the person who knew Elvis Presley best was never a lover, never a bandmate, and never a friend in the way the world defines friendship? What if she was the quiet woman who made his bed every morning, who picked up what he left behind, and who saw things inside those walls that no camera ever captured? She was not famous. She was not powerful. She was the woman who moved through the most private spaces of the most famous man in the world, and she saw everything. For decades, she carried it alone. She watched others tell their versions of his story, some true, some twisted, and she stayed silent anyway. But now, after more than 40 years of keeping what she knows locked away, the woman who cleaned Elvis Presley's bedroom at Graceland has finally chosen to speak, and what she saw behind that closed door will change everything you thought you knew about the king. Who was Nancy Rooks? There is a certain kind of person who keeps the world running without ever getting the credit for it, the kind who shows up before sunrise, does the hard work quietly, and goes home without asking for applause. Nancy Rooks was exactly that kind of person, and for years she was one of the most important people inside Graceland. Not because she was famous, not because she sang or played or performed, but because she was trusted. Nancy joined the Graceland household staff in the 1960s, a time when Elvis Presley was still riding one of the biggest waves of his career. She was hired to help run the domestic side of the mansion, which sounds simple enough until you understand what that actually meant. Graceland was not just a house, it was a world unto itself, a place with its own schedule, its own rules, its own rhythm, and Nancy had to learn all of it. She was not there for the glamour, she was there to work, and she worked hard. Day after day, she moved through those famous rooms, cleaning, organizing, maintaining the spaces that Elvis called home. She ironed, she tidied, she managed, and she did it all with a quiet professionalism that earned her something most people who came through Graceland never quite managed to hold on to. She earned Elvis's trust. Now that kind of trust does not come easy. Elvis Presley was surrounded by people every single hour of every single day. There were musicians, managers, bodyguards, hangers-on, friends, family members, and fans pressing against the gates at all hours. Most of the people in his orbit wanted something from him: fame, money, connection, or just the story they could tell later. Nancy wanted none of that. She wanted to do her job and do it well. And Elvis noticed. Over time, she became a fixture of his daily life. She saw him in the morning when his guard was completely down. She saw him tired, emotional, frustrated, and tender. She saw the version of Elvis Presley that the concert posters and the magazine covers never showed, and she remembered all of it. People around Elvis came and went. Some stayed for a season and disappeared. Some sold their stories the moment they stepped off the property. Nancy Rooks did neither. She stayed for years. And when she finally left, she stayed quiet for decades longer. Which is exactly what makes what she has now chosen to share so extraordinary. Because when a woman who kept silent for that long finally decides to speak, you can be sure that what she has to say is worth hearing. Behind the velvet rope, what tourists never see. Millions of people have walked through Graceland. They have shuffled through the jungle room, stared up at the mirrored ceiling in the billiard room, and stood quietly in front of Elvis's grave in the meditation garden. They have bought the tickets, taken the photographs, and carried home the memory of a place that feels almost too surreal to be real. Some of them cry. Some of them just stand there, unable to fully explain what they are feeling. Because there is something about Graceland that reaches into people, even people who were not alive when Elvis was. That is the power of the place. But here is the thing about Graceland that every single one of those tourists missed. What they saw was the version of Graceland that was meant to be seen. The real Graceland, the one that Nancy Rooks walked through every single day, was something else entirely. It was loud, and it was strange, and it was deeply, unmistakably human. The mansion had its own internal clock that ran completely backwards from the rest of the world. When normal people were waking up and making coffee and starting their days, Graceland was just settling down for the night. Elvis slept through the morning. He came alive after dark. And everyone who worked there, Nancy included, had to bend their entire lives around his schedule without complaint and without question. That was simply how things worked inside those gates. The rooms that tourists admire today were lived-in spaces back then. Really lived in. The jungle room, with its waterfall, and its green shag carpet, and its wild assortment of furniture that looked like it had been chosen by someone who had never once worried about what other people thought, was not a museum piece. It was where Elvis actually spent time. He liked it in there. He found it comfortable in a way that more conventional spaces never seemed to make him feel. He recorded music in that room. He sat in those strange carved chairs and felt, apparently, at home. And Nancy had to clean it regularly, working around the artifacts of a man who never did anything quite the way other people did. The kitchen was another universe altogether. Elvis had very specific ideas about food, and those ideas did not follow any recognizable logic except his own. Everybody knows about the peanut butter and banana sandwiches, the ones fried in butter until they were golden and heavy and completely excessive by any reasonable standard. But that was just the beginning. He had late-night cravings that would send the kitchen into full operation at 2 or 3 in the morning without warning. Entire meals prepared in the small hours for a man who operated on a schedule that the rest of the world would have found impossible. He wanted what he wanted when he wanted it, and the staff adjusted accordingly, because that was the arrangement, and everybody understood it. But the kitchen, and the jungle room, and the famous television room with the 3 screens, mounted side by side so Elvis could watch multiple channels simultaneously, those were the spaces people already talk about. Those were the spaces with stories already attached to them, stories that have been told and retold until they feel almost comfortable. What Nancy Rooks saw that nobody has properly talked about was something else. It was the bedroom, the private space, the room that was never on the official tour, never opened to the public, never photographed for the brochures. The room where Elvis Presley was most completely and vulnerably himself. And that room, she would eventually reveal, held more than anybody outside those walls ever suspected. The bedroom nobody talks about. If you wanted to understand Elvis Presley, really understand him beneath the rhinestone jumpsuits and the curled lip and the voice that could shake a stadium full of people, you had to see his bedroom, because that room was not just where he slept. It was where he hid. Nancy Rooks has described Elvis's bedroom as a place of almost overwhelming darkness. Not darkness in a sinister sense, but literal, physical darkness. The windows were covered heavily, completely blocked against the outside world. Elvis could not sleep with light coming in. He could barely sleep at all. But the absence of light was about more than just rest. That darkened room was a retreat from everything outside it, from the noise, the demands, the endless pressure of being the most famous entertainer on the planet. The room was large, as you would expect for a mansion of that scale, but Elvis filled it in ways that surprised people. There were books, a significant number of books, and this is something that Nancy specifically noted because it caught her off guard when she first started working there. People did not think of Elvis Presley as a reader. They thought of him as a performer, a showman, an instinctive talent rather than an intellectual one. But the books in that bedroom told a different story. He was drawn to spiritual text, to writings on numerology, on self-discovery, on the deeper questions of human existence. He had copies of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, He kept religious texts from multiple traditions side by side without any apparent contradiction in his mind. He was genuinely searching for something. Nancy saw those books every day when she came in to clean, and she understood even then that this was a man who was wrestling with questions that his fame gave him no easy answers to. But the books were not the thing that stayed with Nancy longest. What she remembered most, what she has now spoken about with a kind of quiet weight in her voice, were the items on his nightstand. Because that nightstand told you everything about the state of Elvis Presley's life in his final years. There were prescription bottles, not one or two, but several. A collection of medications prescribed by his personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, the man who would later become known as Dr. Nick. The bottles were always there. Nancy moved around them when she cleaned. She never touched them. That was understood without anyone having to say it. Alongside the medications were other things. A Bible that showed genuine signs of use, pages bent, passages underlined, the spine worn soft from handling, a photograph of his mother, Gladys, which never moved from its spot no matter what else changed in that room, and sometimes crumpled pieces of paper with handwriting on them. Song ideas, Nancy believed. Words he had scrawled in the middle of the night when sleep would not come and his mind kept moving. That bedroom, Nancy has said, felt like the inside of a man's soul. Everything he kept hidden from the world was in that room. The longing, the faith, the fear, the restlessness. Elvis Presley was not just a performer living between concerts. He was a deeply complicated human being carrying a weight that very few people around him truly understood. And Nancy Rooks understood it better than most because she walked into that room every single day. The pills, the rituals, and the secret routines. There was a rhythm to Elvis Presley's days inside Graceland that outsiders never saw and insiders rarely discussed. Nancy Rooks saw it all. She lived it alongside him in the particular way that only a trusted member of the household staff can. Close enough to know everything, invisible enough to be forgotten, she was there. The medication situation at Graceland was something that Nancy has spoken about with a measured, careful honesty. She is not the first person to raise it. Priscilla Presley spoke about it. Linda Thompson, who lived with Elvis for 4 years, spoke about it with tremendous pain in her voice. But Nancy's perspective is different because she was not emotionally entangled with him in the same way. She was an observer, a clear-eyed one, and what she observed was a man whose relationship with prescription drugs had become deeply embedded in the structure of his daily life. It started, as these things often do, with legitimate need. Elvis struggled with sleep his entire adult life. The touring schedule, the pressure, the inability to ever truly step off the stage and become a private person, all of it fed an insomnia that plagued him for years. The medications were meant to help. And in the beginning, perhaps they did. But by the time Nancy was working closely in his personal spaces, the prescriptions had multiplied. There were pills to help him sleep, pills to help him wake up, pills for pain, pills for anxiety. Dr. Nick supplied them, and the nightstand held them all. Nancy has described mornings, or what passed for mornings in Graceland's upside-down schedule, when she would come in to clean and find evidence of a night that had gone badly. Items displaced. The bedding tangled in ways that suggested restless, broken sleep rather than rest. And always, the pill bottles. Some of them moved from where they had been the day before. But here's the thing that Nancy always made a point of saying, and this is important. She never saw Elvis as a reckless man. She never saw him as someone chasing a high or trying to numb himself out of carelessness. What she saw was a frightened person trying to manage an existence that had long ago slipped beyond his control. He was not trying to destroy himself. He was trying to survive. And in between the difficult mornings, there were the rituals, that showed you the other side of him. Elvis was meticulous about certain things in ways that surprised people. He cared deeply about his personal appearance, which anyone who watched him perform already knew, but the extent of it in private was something else. Nancy has described the care he took every single time he prepared to face the world outside his bedroom door. The process was elaborate and precise and deeply personal. He was building his armor, putting on the version of himself that could walk out there and be Elvis Presley. He was also, and this surprised many people when Nancy began sharing these details, genuinely funny in private. Not the polished, performed charm he showed in interviews, but actually spontaneously funny in the way that people are when nobody is performing for anybody. He made the staff laugh. He remembered their names, their birthdays, details about their families that he had no professional obligation to retain. That was not an act. Nancy was clear about that. That was just who he was when the weight lifted for a moment. The side of Elvis nobody expected. There is a version of Elvis Presley that the world decided on a long time ago. The bloated, pill-addled king stumbling through his final years. The cautionary tale about fame and excess. That version is not entirely false. But Nancy Rook spent years watching the fuller picture, and she has carried something that she clearly felt the world needed to hear. The man inside Graceland was more than the tragedy that history turned him into. She has talked about his generosity in terms that go beyond the famous stories of him buying cars for strangers and renting out amusement parks for his friends. Those stories are true, and they matter. But Nancy saw the quieter version of that same impulse. She saw him notice when a staff member was going through something hard. She saw him make gestures that cost him nothing except attention, which was actually the most valuable thing Elvis Presley had to give, because everyone wanted it. When he directed it at you, really directed it at you as a human being and not as a fan, it meant something. He talked to Nancy. Not always, not every day. But there were moments in the particular quiet of Graceland's strange hours when he would speak to her not as an employer to an employee, but simply as one person to another. He asked about her life. He listened to the answers. And sometimes he said things that revealed the interior of a man who was far more self-aware than people gave him credit for. He knew, Nancy has said. He knew that things were not right. He knew that the life he was living had gotten away from him in certain ways. He was not blind to it. He was not in denial the way people sometimes assume. He simply did not know how to change course. The machine around him, the management, the schedule, the whole apparatus of being Elvis had so much momentum that stopping it, or even slowing it down, felt impossible. And the people closest to him, the ones who might have helped him find another way, could not quite break through either. Nancy also witnessed something in that bedroom that she has only recently felt comfortable speaking about. She found evidence of genuine spiritual searching that went beyond the books on the nightstand. Elvis left notes to himself. Prayers, she believed, or something very close to prayers. Words addressed to God, or to his mother, or to some version of both at once. He was reaching for something that fame could not provide, and money could not purchase. He wanted peace. Real, lasting, quiet peace. And he could not find it in that house no matter how dark he made the room, or how many hours he spent sleeping. That searching side of him, Nancy has always insisted, was the most real thing about him. More real than the performances. More real than the legend. The man on his knees, metaphorically and sometimes literally, asking for something bigger than himself to make sense of the life he was living. That was Elvis Presley, and it is the version of him that history has consistently underestimated. What she kept quiet for decades. And why? The obvious question is always the same one. If Nancy Rooks saw all of this, why did she wait so long to say anything? It is a fair question, and the answer is more complicated and more human than people might expect. Part of it was loyalty. Pure, uncomplicated loyalty of the kind that is increasingly rare. Nancy did not feel that what she witnessed inside Graceland belonged to her to share. She had been trusted. She had been let into the most private spaces of a man's life, and that man had extended her a respect that she felt obligated to honor in return. Elvis never told her to keep quiet. He never had to. She understood it the way you understand certain things that do not need to be spoken out loud. Part of it was also the aftermath. When Elvis died on the 16th of August 1977, Graceland did not simply grieve and move on. It became a battleground. There were legal disputes, financial pressures, competing versions of events, and an entire industry of people trying to stake their claim on the Elvis Presley story. Nancy watched all of that unfold and wanted no part of it. She had her own grief to deal with. She had lost someone she had known intimately for years. The circus happening around that loss made her retreat further into silence rather than stepping into the noise. And then there was the more practical matter of what speaking up would have meant at the time. The 1980s were a complicated moment for Elvis's legacy. The estate was in trouble. Priscilla was working to stabilize it, to open Graceland to the public, and build something lasting out of the wreckage. Nancy understood, without anyone having to explain it to her, that certain revelations at certain times could do damage that could not be undone. She chose to protect the legacy rather than expose the man. But years became decades, and decades have a way of changing your perspective on what matters and what does not. Nancy Rooks is not a young woman anymore, and like many people who have carried something important for a very long time, she reached a point where the weight of staying silent felt greater than the weight of speaking. She had watched versions of Elvis's story get told over and over again, some of them accurate, many of them not, and she felt, increasingly, that the version she held inside her was one that deserved to exist in the world, not to shock, not to sell, but because the full truth of a person, even a complicated truth, is more of an honor than a careful silence that lets myths fill the space where reality should be. The last days. Nancy Rooks has said that the weeks leading up to Elvis's death were different from anything that had come before. Different in a way that she noticed, but could not quite name at the time. A shift in the atmosphere of Graceland that felt significant even if she could not have explained exactly why. He was tired. That much was obvious, and had been obvious for a while. Elvis had always pushed himself hard, but by the summer of 1977, the exhaustion had taken on a different quality. It was not the tiredness of a man who had worked too hard and needed rest. It was the tiredness of a man whose body was struggling to do things it should have been able to do easily. Nancy saw it in the way he moved, slower, more careful, like someone navigating terrain they were not entirely sure of. His appetite, always specific and particular, had become even more inconsistent. There were days when he barely ate, days when the kitchen prepared things he requested and then left untouched. Nancy cleared those plates. She noticed. The bedroom in those final weeks felt heavier than usual. That is the only word she has been able to find for it. Heavier. The darkness that Elvis had always kept in that room seemed to have deepened somehow. The pill bottles on the nightstand were more numerous than they had been before. Nancy has described moving carefully around them, feeling a discomfort she could not quite articulate but could not ignore either. There were people around him constantly, as there always were. The Memphis Mafia, that loose collection of friends and associates who had orbited Elvis for years, filled the house with their presence. But Nancy has observed, carefully and without judgment, that presence is not the same as attention. There were a lot of people in that house. Whether anyone was truly watching, truly paying the right kind of attention to the man at the center of all of it, is a question she has let hang in the air without quite answering directly. She last saw Elvis Presley 2 days before he died. He was heading to bed after a night that had run long even by Graceland standards. He passed her in the hallway, and he said something to her. Something brief and ordinary. The kind of thing you say to someone you pass in a corridor without any sense that it might be the last time you ever speak to them. Nancy has not shared exactly what he said, and she does not need to. The point is not the words. The point is that neither of them knew, and that is the most devastating part of all of it. On the 16th of August, 1977, Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on his bathroom floor. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death listed cardiac arrhythmia, but the deeper truth was more complicated and has been debated ever since. Nancy Rooks was not in the house when it happened. She learned the news the way the rest of the world did, in the shock and the chaos of that afternoon. And she has said that nothing in her life prepared her for it, even though some part of her, the quiet, observant part that had watched him so carefully for so long, recognized that the warning signs had been there. They had been there for a while, and not enough people had known what to do with them. What her revelation changes here is the thing about a story that has been told as many times as Elvis Presley's story has been told. You start to think there is nothing left to learn. You start to think that every angle has been covered, every secret exposed, every corner of his life examined under a bright enough light that nothing could possibly remain in the shadow. And then someone like Nancy Rooks speaks up, and you realize how wrong that assumption was. What Nancy's revelations change is not the broad outline of Elvis's life, the dates, the records, the performances, the marriages, the decline, and the death. Those facts remain exactly as they were. What changes is the texture of the man inside all of those facts. The version of Elvis that emerges from Nancy's account is more human than the legend and more sympathetic than the cautionary tale. He was a man who read spiritual books alone in a dark room and left handwritten prayers on his nightstand. He was a man who asked his housekeeper about her family and actually listened to the answer. He was a man who knew, on some level, that his life had become something he could not entirely control, and who reached for grace in the private moments when nobody was watching. Or so he thought. That version of Elvis Presley deserves a place in the record alongside all the others, alongside the young man from Tupelo who walked into Sun Studio and changed the direction of American music forever, alongside the soldier who served his country quietly in West Germany and fell in love with a 14-year-old girl who would become his wife, alongside the performer who filled stadiums and the man who couldn't sleep, and the father who loved his daughter with everything he had even when he couldn't always show it properly. Nancy Rooks did not come forward to tear anything down. She came forward because she spent decades watching a man get reduced to either a god or a punchline, and felt that neither one was fair to who he actually was. She came forward because loyalty, real loyalty, eventually means telling the truth, even when silence would have been easier. Graceland stands today as a monument to Elvis Presley's legacy. Millions of people still walk through those rooms every year. They stand at the grave in the meditation garden and feel something genuine about a man most of them never met. That connection is real. That love is real. But the man those people are honoring was more complicated and more searching and more quietly heartbreaking than the monument suggests. Nancy Rooks saw the man, not the monument. And that is exactly why, after all these years and all this silence, what she has chosen to share matters so much. Not everyone who shapes a legend gets remembered by name. Some of them move quietly through the background, doing their work, keeping their counsel, carrying what they know until they decide the world is ready to hear it. Nancy Rooks spent decades inside Graceland, and decades more holding on to what she witnessed there. What she found in Elvis Presley's bedroom was not a scandal. It was a human being, searching, struggling, reaching, and ultimately unreachable in the ways that mattered most. The king had secrets,